Welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we'll be trying to understand why it's so hard to focus in the world we live in. Our guide for this deep dive is Stolen Focus by Johann Hari, along with a summary of the book. And of course, I have an expert here to help us unpack all these ideas. It'll almost be like you're here in the conversation with us.
Yeah, it feels like a lot of people are realizing that something is off about how well they can focus these days.
Mm.
And, that can have huge implications for everyone.
Absolutely. And Hari starts by sharing some pretty alarming stats. Like, did you know that the average American spends something like 5.4 hours every day on their phone? That's crazy compared to just 17 minutes spent reading books. What do you think that kind of shift is doing to our brains?
Well, Hari gets into all of the underlying causes of this attention crisis. And one of those is the myth of multitasking. We're always being told to juggle tons of things at once. But research is showing us that our brains just aren't made for that.
It's like trying to run a million programs on your computer at the same time. Eventually, it just crashes.
That's such a good analogy. Every time you switch between different tasks, there's a switching cost because your brain has to sort of reorient itself every time. So you actually end up being less productive and making more mistakes when you try to do everything at once.
So instead of multitasking, we should really be trying to single task, just focusing on one thing at a time.
Exactly. It's all about understanding your own limits and working with them. You have to create an environment that supports, not sabotages, your focus.
That reminds me of those flow states that people talk about, like when you get so absorbed in something that time just flies by. It's fascinating that Harry connects this to his own personal experience in Provincetown. After he quit using his smartphone and started sleeping more, he found that it was easier to reach those flow states.
It's a really interesting point. It highlights how important sleep is to our cognitive function. I think a lot of people underestimate that. Harry even talks about how prioritizing sleep changed his mornings. He was able to wake up feeling refreshed without needing caffeine.
I think we could all use a bit of that, right? But I think it's fair to say a lot of us are constantly sleep deprived, especially with all the artificial light from our devices.
That's a huge problem.
Yeah.
That blue light coming from your devices completely messes up your natural sleep cycles. It makes it much harder to fall asleep and to stay asleep. If you want to improve your focus, one of the most important things you can do is create an environment that's good for sleep. And that also means limiting how much you look at screens before you go to bed.
Okay, you're totally calling me out with my late night scrolling habit. But let's get back to how all these tech companies are affecting our attention. Harry really gets into this idea of the attention economy and the role that these social media algorithms play.
It's really important to understand exactly what's going on here. These algorithms are literally designed to get you hooked. They constantly feed you this personalized content and exploit your psychological vulnerabilities just to keep you scrolling. Think about it. Facebook is a free service, right? But your attention is the actual product that they're selling. They collect data on you to understand how to keep you on their platform. Then they sell that attention to advertisers.
It's kind of scary when you think about it like that. It's like we're all part of this giant experiment where we're constantly being given these dopamine hits that keep us coming back for more. But Hari actually says that it's not enough to just rely on willpower and self-control to fight back against the system. He uses this term cruel optimism. It's like telling someone to just eat less when they're stuck in a candy store that's made to make them crave sugar.
Yeah, you're totally setting them up to fail. Individual effort is good, but these simple solutions just ignore the much deeper systematic problems here. It's like you're swimming upstream against a really strong current.
So if individual effort is not enough, where do we go from here? Is there any hope for us?
Hari argues that we need to start implementing political and regulatory solutions. He suggests that we could require social media companies to only send notifications in batches. That way you aren't constantly interrupted. Or we could limit how much companies are allowed to use these manipulative algorithms that are designed to keep you hooked. It's about holding these tech giants accountable. We need to start treating attention as a public good, just like clean air and water.
Those are some bold ideas. It's fascinating how Hari connects these seemingly unrelated topics, like when he compares the addictive nature of technology to confining children.
Right. He's really good at connecting those dots between things that might seem totally separate at first. He argues that both overscheduled children and adults who are always on their devices are missing out on unstructured time. And that's really important for developing a healthy sense of focus.
It's almost like we're training our brains to be stimulated all the time. Like we're always just waiting for that next notification or dopamine hit.
Exactly. And this doesn't just affect our individual well-being, but also our ability to function as a society. A society that can't focus just can't solve complex problems, or engage in meaningful dialogue, or resist manipulation.
So this isn't just about being more productive at work or remembering where you put your keys. It's about humanity's ability to even address the challenges that we're facing.
Absolutely. Hari is very direct about the political side of this crisis.
Yeah.
He says that attention needs to be seen as a public good that we need to protect, just like clean air and water.
But how are we supposed to do that? These tech companies are incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. But Hari gives some examples from history where seemingly impossible things were overcome, like the movement to end child labor, or the fight for women's suffrage, or the battle to reduce environmental pollution. These were long and hard fights, but they eventually succeeded because people came together to demand change.
So he's saying that we need a similar movement to reclaim our attention, like an attention rebellion.
That's exactly what he's saying. We have to start pushing back against the things that are stealing our focus and demand change from these tech companies and from our politicians. And that starts with you. Start setting boundaries with your technology and create spaces for deep thinking and focus in your own life.
This has really made me think about my own habits and how I can be more intentional about how I protect my attention. But honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around this idea that it's a systemic problem. It just feels so big, almost too big to understand.
It is definitely complex.
Yeah.
But Hori does a great job of breaking it down so that it's relatable. One example he uses that I think is really powerful is leaded gasoline. For decades, we were adding lead to gasoline, even though scientists knew that it was bad for us, especially for children's developing brains.
So we were basically poisoning ourselves because it was more convenient or profitable.
Basically, yeah. It took a lot of time and effort from scientists, activists, and policymakers to ban leaded gasoline.
Mm.
But they did it, and we saw a huge improvement in children's cognitive ability as a result.
That's a pretty striking analogy. So is Hari saying that the way we're using technology today is kind of like adding lead to gasoline? Maybe it seems convenient or beneficial at first, but in the long run, it's actually harming our minds.
That's the main point of his argument. And just like with the leaded gasoline, it's going to take a group effort to solve this problem. We need to start demanding better from the companies that are getting rich off of our distraction. And we need to start changing our own lives so that we prioritize focus and attention.
Okay, so we've talked about the problem and the need for collective action. Now let's get into some of the specific solutions that Hari proposes. He talks a lot about the need for regulation, right?
Yes, he does. He says that we need to move past this model of self-regulation, where tech companies are basically just trusted to police themselves. He suggests that we should require companies to batch notifications. That way you don't constantly get interrupted. We could limit the use of manipulative algorithms. And we could even create a digital bill of rights to protect our attention as a fundamental human right.
Wow, those are some big ideas. But wouldn't these regulations just stifle innovation? It seems like that's always the argument against government intervention in tech.
That's definitely a valid concern, and Hari talks about it in the book. He says that right now, this model of unregulated innovation has created a race to the bottom, where companies are fighting for your attention no matter the cost, even if it hurts you. He thinks that setting some boundaries and ethical guidelines could actually encourage more responsible and sustainable types of innovation.
That makes sense. It's kind of like setting speed limits on a highway. It might seem restrictive, but it actually makes things safer and more efficient for everyone.
Exactly. But it's not all about regulation. Hari also talks about the importance of those individual actions we mentioned before. Become more aware of how tech is affecting your attention. Set some boundaries with your devices. Make some tech-free zones and times in your day, and practice things that encourage focus, like mindfulness, meditation, or just spending time in nature.
These are all things we can start doing today. We don't have to wait for the government.
That's right. And Hari reminds us that these individual actions aren't just about being more productive or self-improvement. They're acts of resistance against a system that wants to distract you and keep you disengaged.
That's a really powerful way to think about it. We have a choice to make. We can either just sit back and be consumers of this technology, or we can stand up and demand something better.
Exactly. The more of us who choose to stand up, the more likely we are to create a world that values focus, attention, and deep thinking.
This has been a really insightful conversation. We've covered a lot, from the science of attention to the politics of technology. I'm personally feeling really inspired to make some changes in my own life.
That's great to hear. One of the most important things that I took away from Hari's book is that this isn't about willpower or discipline. It's about creating a culture that values attention, a world where you aren't constantly bombarded with distractions and where you have time to think deeply, connect with other people, and engage with the world in meaningful ways.
Yeah, it's a beautiful idea. And it's definitely something worth working towards. One of the things that really hit me in the book was when Hari takes us behind the scenes in Silicon Valley. He interviews all these former tech guys who talk about how these platforms are literally made to be addictive.
It's almost like we're being manipulated on purpose, which goes back to his comparison with how we confine kids. Both overscheduled kids and adults who can't put down their devices are missing out on that unstructured time, the kind of time you need to develop a healthy sense of focus. That's exactly it. It's like we're training our brains to constantly be stimulated, always looking for that next notification or that next dopamine hit. And this doesn't just affect us individually, but also how well we function as a society. If a society can't focus, then it can't solve complex problems. It can't have real conversations. It can't resist being controlled.
So this is so much bigger than just being more productive or remembering where you left your keys.
Yeah.
This is about the very foundation of democracy and our ability to face the huge challenges in front of us.
You got it. Hari says that we need to start thinking about attention as something we need to protect, like a public good, just like clean air and water. It's a resource that's being worn down, and we need to fight for it.
But these tech companies are huge. How can we even begin to push back against that?
Hari knows it's a big challenge. But he points out that throughout history, there have been seemingly impossible things that we've overcome. Look at the movement to end child labor, or getting women the right to vote, or the fight to clean up pollution. These were all incredibly hard and long fights. But ultimately, they succeeded because people got together and demanded change.
So he's suggesting that we need that same kind of movement for our attention, like an attention rebellion.
Exactly. He says we need to push back against the things that are stealing our focus and demand changes from the tech companies and the politicians. And it all starts with what you do. Start setting those boundaries with your tech and create spaces in your own life for deep thinking and focus.
This is making me think about my own habits and how I can be more careful about protecting my attention. But one thing I'm still trying to understand is how this is a systemic problem. It's
Yeah.
just so huge, almost too big to even think about.
It is complex. But Hari's really good at breaking it down and making it make sense.
Yeah.
One example he uses that I think is really effective is the whole thing with leaded gasoline. For decades, we were adding lead to gas, even though scientists knew how bad it was for us, especially for kids and their developing brains.
So we were literally poisoning ourselves just because it was convenient or profitable.
Pretty much. It took so much time and effort from scientists, activists, and politicians to ban leaded gas.
Hmm.
But they did it. And because of that, kids' cognitive abilities got so much better.
That's a really powerful analogy. So is Hari suggesting that how we use tech today is kind of like adding lead to gas? Like maybe it's convenient or helpful in the moment, but eventually it just ends up hurting our minds.
That's the main point. And just like with the leaded gas, it's going to take everyone working together to fix this. We have to start demanding better from these companies that are getting rich off of distracting us. And we need to make changes in our own lives so we focus more on attention and focus.
Okay, so we've talked about the problem and that we need to work together. Now, what about the solutions? Hari talks a lot about the need for regulation, right?
He does. He says that we need to move past this system of self-regulation, where these tech companies are basically in charge of policing themselves. He suggests all sorts of regulations like making companies batch notifications. So we're not constantly interrupted. We could limit how they use those manipulative algorithms, and we could even create a digital bill of rights to protect our attention as a basic human right.
Those are so... Yeah, that does make sense. It's like putting speed limits on the highway. It might seem limiting, but it actually keeps everyone safer and makes things more efficient.
Exactly. But it's not all about regulations. Hari also talks about how important those individual actions are that we discussed earlier. Being more aware of how tech affects your attention, setting boundaries with your devices, creating tech-free spaces and times during the day, and practicing things that help you focus, like mindfulness and meditation, or even just spending some time outdoors.
These are all things we can start doing right now. We don't have to wait for the government to do something.
Exactly. And Hari says that these things aren't just about improving yourself or being more productive. They're acts of resistance against a system that's trying to distract you and keep you from being engaged.
That's a really powerful way to think about it. It's our choice. We can be passive consumers of this technology, or we can start pushing back and demanding something better.
That's right. And the more of us that demand better, the more likely we are to make a world that values focus, attention, and deep thinking.
This has been a really amazing conversation. We've learned so much. From the science of attention to the politics of tech, I feel inspired to start making changes in my own life. How about you? Did any of this stand out to you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest takeaways for the book is that this isn't about willpower or discipline. It's about creating a culture where we actually value attention, a world where we aren't constantly bombarded with distractions, and where we have time to actually think, connect with others, and engage with the world in a meaningful way.
Yeah, it really is inspiring to imagine what a world that really valued attention would look like. And Hari's book does give us a map to get there. One thing he says is that getting our focus back isn't just about getting rid of distractions, it's also about making the right environment for focus to grow.
Yeah, that's so true. And that's where flow comes back in. Remember Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the guy who studied flow states? He found that people get into a state of flow when they're doing things that are both hard and meaningful to them.
So it's not just about finding a quiet place and turning off your phone, it's about finding work or hobbies that really make you want to focus.
Exactly. And this is why the comparison to how kids play is so important. When kids are playing freely, they just naturally do things that are challenging and interesting. They're always pushing themselves, experimenting, and learning new things.
And while they're doing all that, they're strengthening their ability to pay attention. They're learning how to focus and concentrate for longer periods.
Exactly. So the question is, how can we as adults bring that same playfulness and curiosity into our lives? How can we make it easier to get into a flow state?
That's a really great question. And I think Hari gives us some good answers. He talks about the importance of making time for unstructured activities like reading, going for a hike, playing music, or just letting your mind wander. He also says we should try to find work that matches our values and interests. That way we're not just going through the motions. And lastly, he encourages us to be curious and wonder about the world around us.
Those are all really good strategies. And it's important to remember that focus isn't just a skill. The people and places around you can help or hurt your ability to focus. Think about the places where you feel most focused and productive. What is it about those places that make you feel that way?
So it's not just about what we do individually, but also the kind of world we make together.
That's exactly right. Just imagine workplaces that are designed to help people focus. Schools that encourage play and exploration. Cities that make it easy to connect with your community. And technology that helps us focus instead of detracting us.
It sounds amazing, but honestly, it feels like that's a long way off.
It's true, we do have some big challenges. But Hari's book gives us some hope. He reminds us that throughout history, humans have always faced really hard problems. And we found ways to solve them.
So it's not about giving up or getting depressed. It's about using that energy to do something, to demand something better for ourselves and for the next generation.
Exactly. It's about understanding that our attention isn't just something personal. It's a resource that we all share, a resource that's essential for a healthy society, and it's worth fighting for.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive. I'm feeling really inspired, but also a little overwhelmed by how big this problem is. Where do we even start?
That's a question that each of us needs to answer for ourselves. But I think the very first step is just being aware that there is a problem. Once you see how your attention is being stolen, you can start making choices to take it back. Think about the places where you can really focus. What can you do to make more of those spaces, both for yourself and for other people?
That's a great challenge for all of us. We need to make a world that's more friendly to attention, not just to be more productive, but for all of our well-being. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into stolen focus. Remember, you have the power to take back your attention.